But as we work through our stewardship program, we are at stewardship, Grace Bible Church, leadership, and followership. And having been put into small, by worldly standards, positions of leadership really most of my life, eventually you start waxing kind of philosophical about it. And you start thinking, all right, well, if I'm going to talk about leadership and followership, what do you say? I mean, there's so much that you could say. And I have 1 week and 2 hours to say it. Right? 2 hours, right? No, I don't have 2 hours to say it. So I really tried to hit the highlights. And of course, tie it into quite a few biblical passages. And there's going to be like 9 different Bible passages I reference today. And I will reference them. We're not going to plow through them. But just really to highlight different aspects of what I think are really essential to leadership. So leadership, that was last week. How do you help? But today, 4 things. And if you have a bulletin, then on the back is those 4 big points, with that little picture to remind you, ready or not, you are leading by example. This is a point I really try to drive home to every follower of Jesus Christ. You are leading. You are a royal priesthood. You are an ambassador. Is royalty leadership? Yes. Is priesthood leadership? Are ambassadors leaders? Yes. It's not really something where Jesus says, well, do you want to be a leader or a follower? You're part of my body. I'm training you to be a leader. And yes, you have to be a good follower to be a good leader. I'll come back to that. But we are leaders. The church is the pillar and ground of truth. It's just whether we're going to lead well or poorly. And we will answer for that. But we are leaders. So I sent this out as we launch into this leadership and followership. And if you get the emails or Facebook, you've seen this. Passion. We talk so much about passion, and we do need passion. I'm not criticizing passion. But passion without self-mastery is a train wreck waiting to happen. Fire, rooted in angst, may create energy and focus, but it rarely produces lasting benevolence. Leaders should be emptied, and, this is the key point, emptied and content with that before they can really be trusted to influence anyone else. A person lacking meekness and gentleness cannot lead well. Given enough time, without that meekness and gentleness, in the wrecking of themselves, they will wreck others. That's what I sent out this week. Now, Scott Garrity, and some of you know Scott, he responded to that. And Scott's in leadership with Cru, Campus Crusade for Christ, and he works with a lot of times. Sometimes people where he's having to deal with conflict and even people leaving ministry. Here's how he responded. This is very true. And unfortunately and sadly, I've seen it play out over and over and over again in evangelical churches and ministries. There's way too much emphasis on passion, vision, strategy, and similar things for leading, and very little talk of being emptied, humbled, and being a servant as the necessary experiences and qualities for being a spiritual leader. And indeed, that misplaced emphasis has led to the destruction of many leaders and many of those who followed. In other words, what do passion, vision, strategy, and things like that have to do with character or humility? The answer is really obvious if we just dare to raise the question. Nothing. Nothing. That's not a critique of passion or vision or strategy. That's just a fact. We must take a different path. Every teenager has passion. Few teenagers are really ready to lead, no matter what they think, and how stupid they think the parents are. 4 things we need to do. Number 1, we need to seek good examples of leadership. I'm going to come to the biblical example in a minute, but just in your life and in history, as you read it, you should be seeking good examples of leadership. I've talked about my concrete boss, Gary Ward, many times. At the time that I went to work for him, I did concrete work to get through college. At the time that I went to work for him when he was starting up his small business, he was, still is in this sense, ex-convict, felony conviction for dealing drugs, nothing he wouldn't tell you. He'll admit it. He's out of jail, trying to rebuild his life and his family. He started a business, foul-mouthed, brawler, fighter, toughest man I probably ever met. Not a big guy. But he lived 2 houses down from me, and he asked me to work for him. I'm like, wow, 2 houses down? I mean, I walk out the door at 6:55, get to his house at 7, I'm clocked in. Great. So he started this business, and he was his niche that he was trying to get into was concrete work, and many of you have heard this story, but he was a general contractor. And one of the ways that he made money early on was as we went through these new construction sites, after you do the curb and gutter and all the stormwater and sewage management stuff, and that goes in first. And then you get all the grading, getting ready to pave roads. And after they pave the roads and all that, you would go back through and you pull up every storm drain or sewer manhole cover to make sure the heavy equipment and things like that hadn't knocked dirt over into the hole and clogged it up. And my boss would be given $50 for every manhole cover that he just lifted up and looked in and made sure it was clear. And if it was backed up, $200. Now, this was like 1985. Okay. So that was a good way to make money. Because you could, if they weren't clogged, bam, $50, bam, $50, bam, $50. And then you lift the lid and you didn't even have to see. You lift the lid, oh. Yeah, that one's clogged. Now you're talking about a sewer hole, storm, so it's about this big around, little ladder going down into it. Well, if it's clogged, then you go down in there, you pull on the rubber boots and the rubber gloves, and you got your little shovel that you cut off the handle and a bucket and a rope. And you go down, you stand in this, and you shovel the bucket up, and then they lift the bucket up, and it's bouncing off the sides and the ladder rungs, and it's spilling on you as you try to clean this thing out. You could do it in probably 15 minutes, but remember, you're in a space like this, so there's not a lot of fresh air. So sometimes you lift the lid off, and as soon as you lifted it, like I said, oh. Now here's this ex-convict, foul-mouthed, brawler, and when you lift the lid off, he'd be like, oh, bleep, 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 oh, all these curse words. And then a typical person like that in this world would say, hey, you, new guy, go clean it out. Not Gary. Gary would smell that and say, I'll do this one. I'll do it. Now, about the second time that he did that, and then the third time you lift the hole up and you smell that, Gary's like, he didn't have the heart to send anybody else in there to do what he wasn't willing to do. But about the third time, what do you think I did? I volunteered. Gary, I'll do it. Now, after you go through the whole crew and you find out there were people who were never going to volunteer, then Gary would be like, you bleep, 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 bleep. No, Rev, they call me Rev even back then. You don't need to go down there. You go. And he'd order them to do it because they were slacking. Now, some people couldn't. Some people just couldn't do it. They'd start to go down in that hole and they'd start gagging and retching and stuff like that. Yeah, that's different. And he would cut them slack. That, I told him later, Gary, you were one of the absolute, if not the best examples of leadership I've ever seen. Because when the sewage of this world was spewing out, who crawled down in that hole and cleaned it up? The only one who had the stomach to do it was Jesus. So you look for things like that in your life. And you also look historically for examples of good leadership, something I've done a fair amount of reading on. There's a recent podcast I listened to of this lady historian who was really deeply researched on, especially Abraham Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Lyndon Johnson, Dwight Eisenhower. And she gave a podcast on leadership, interviewed by another guy. And she noted certain things in all of these people, in their personal lives. Number one, in their early 20s, they verbalized, in a way, this ambition to achieve something for the greater good. Not so much for themselves, I'm going to be a millionaire. Just, I want to make the world a better place. Of course, in your early 20s, you have that zeal and that ambition, but you're nowhere near ready to actually make the world a better place. You're not even ready to make yourself a better person. You're just starting. But they did have that ambition. Number two, they had a lot of personal struggle, especially Abraham Lincoln, when you really look at his upbringing. But Franklin Roosevelt, polio. He'd been very athletic, and he suffered polio, and he lost all that. They go through this personal struggle, and there's a quote from Ernest Hemingway that summarizes this. Everybody is broken by life. Everyone is broken by life. But afterwards, some people are stronger in the broken places. And they showed that. They showed resiliency and perseverance, and that's time. It wasn't enough to bounce back and be stronger in a broken place and have passion. You needed time, decades, resiliency and perseverance. They saw in the worst crises a greater opportunity, but also understood that that can cause people to need a crisis. And we do that, especially leaders. If there's no crisis for them to shine, they'll create one. And so that's not really leading. But they did see when things are at their worst, a leader's at their best. They were steady. They were able to control their emotions. And they were surrounded with conflict from differing perspectives and egos, which the leader is able to handle because they realize, I need that perspective. So those are kind of some historical examples and personal examples of leadership. But in the end, when you seek good examples of leadership, we need to look to what's revealed, not just what's reasoned. I'm not saying there isn't a place for really doing this study and this research. I've done it. I'm always looking for good examples of leadership. But in the Bible, you have things that are revealed. Where God speaks about what is good and what is bad, that's just a totally different level. And the ultimate leader, of course, is Jesus. Because Jesus brings the historical process and living his life and watching and observing things and learning, and the Bible follows the historical process. But Jesus has all that. He probably saw things, hopefully Joseph wasn't cursing and swearing. But as Joseph was a builder, Jesus probably saw things like, wow, okay, and made a note of that and grew in wisdom and stature. He has all that, those human experiences, that history, but he's the very Word of the Father. So he brings together the experienced and the revealed and tells us how to lead. He brings it together. Though he is God become man, he is not just king because of privilege. He's not just some blue blood who inherited the throne. He laid aside his privilege and his blue blood, and he earned it. He demonstrated when everyone else failed in the whole history of the human race, he succeeded. That's a leader. I use this analogy a lot. Making good decisions and being a leader is what I call the analyst-agent balance. And it's from our own intelligence community. You have your analyst behind the desk, who hopefully, not always true, but hopefully, they have a better picture. They kind of see the bigger picture. And they bring that data and that analysis to the situation. Then you have your agent in the field. And he's dealing with people and situations and craziness and a lot of gray and a lot of shades of gray. And he's making real-time decisions. And he's trusting his gut. And you really need both. And what the analyst behind the desk needs to do is trust and empower the agent in the field. And what the agent in the field needs to do, and I tell people this, I know Rodrigo's heard it, don't go rogue on me. Where's Rodrigo? He wasn't here. Sarah's heard. He's gone rogue on me. I say this a lot. Because from the point of view of someone I'm empowering, if I'm the analyst behind the desk, I'll tell them, look, I will support you. I will empower you. Please don't put me in a position where I cannot defend you. Don't go rogue on me. And a lot of times, we're really good at being the analyst behind the desk, especially people who don't like to be and have never really wanted to be the agent in the field. Because anybody who's an agent in the field who's making these leadership decisions with all these people, man, if you go through every decision they make, you're going to find a lot of ones where you're like, I don't like that decision. That doesn't make it necessarily right or wrong. It just means you're different and you would have made a different decision. Well, Jesus is both. He's the analyst behind the desk. He's the very word of the Father who's trusted with all judgment. And he is the ultimate agent in the field who overlooks Judas's treachery just to tell Judas he loves him anyway. And he's not like blindsided by Judas's treachery. He knows. That's Jesus. He is the leader. He is the ultimate leader. And so we have to keep imitating Jesus. We have to imitate him in 4 ways. As we imitate Jesus, we imitate his actions. I'm going to roll through these for you. His heart, his self-mastery, and his humility. And there's some passages for you. In his actions, Jesus kept it really simple. Peter says this in Acts 10:38. Jesus of Nazareth was a man empowered by God's Spirit to go around doing good and delivering all those oppressed by the devil. So 2 things there. Just keep doing good and don't shrink back from the worst forms of evil. And don't be afraid. Act. That simple. In Ephesians 4 is the great passage where it talks about how when Jesus ascended on high, he gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastor, teachers, to equip the saints, to empower the saints for the work of the ministry. Jesus promotes people and empowers them to act. Meanwhile, he says, I'm just going to do good. And where the things are the most evil and the most wicked and occultic and weird and scary, I'm going to step in. I'm not going to send someone else in that hole. I'll go. Maybe people follow me, maybe they won't, but I'll go. His actions, we imitate that. As far as his heart, 2 Corinthians 10, 1-7 says, by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I beseech you. Paul says to Timothy in his own passing the baton of leadership, Timothy, the servant of the Lord must not strive, but must be gentle to all, even those that are opposing him or opposing themselves. Gentleness, meekness and gentleness, but the heart is gentleness. Gentleness in 2 Corinthians 10 and in 2 Timothy 2 doesn't mean, oh, they're there. That's not what it means. It's actually this very deliberate attempt to view people's behavior in the least damning light you can that explains their behavior. It's a judicial term. It's a recognition that stop being so reductionist. A lot of it is not innocent or guilty. A lot of it is we don't know enough, so we're going to call them not guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And if you call someone not guilty beyond reasonable doubt, how do you treat them? Like they're innocent. You don't know enough to actually say they are. Ultimately, that's for God. But gentleness is a mastery of how the self interacts with other people. He is gentle, and he spends his energy making you better and healing you. That's his heart. 2 Corinthians 10 also talks about the meekness of Christ. In the Old Testament, who's called the meekest man in all the earth? Moses. See, we don't usually think of Moses as meek when we hear that word. We think like church mouse, meek little mouse. But meekness is mastery of the self-awareness of God. Aristotle is one of our best sources for really understanding these ideas. And Aristotle talked about a meek person is someone who regulates their passions well. It's not that they never get angry, but they get angry at the right amount, at the right time, for the right reason. The meekness is something I often say, they lead their heart. They don't follow their heart. Moses was the meekest man in all the earth, but what were his two greatest failures? Meekness. When he killed the Egyptian, when he struck the rock, his passions got the better of him. And they both had, for him, catastrophic consequences. Well, Moses is not the best example of meekness in the Bible. He's a great example. But of course, Jesus is the best example of meekness. Meekness is mastery of the self's response to God before you even get to anybody else. Gentleness is a mastery of the self's response to others. And that's what empowers change. If you read that passage in 2 Corinthians 10, and I would encourage you to read it, it says it's this meekness and gentleness. It's not that we don't fight, but the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of this world. So it doesn't even look like we're fighting. Because a meek and gentle person doesn't even look like they're fighting. But the meekness and gentleness of Christ are the weapons that can demolish strongholds of thinking. And not just be right, but heal the other person. Jesus can be right and end everything right now. He could have been right and summoned the angels in Gethsemane. But instead, he showed meekness. And he mastered all the passions that abandonment and denial and betrayal would arise in him. All the passions that just the pain of it would arise in him. All of the passions that we can't even imagine of taking on the sin of humanity. And he mastered all of that and he absorbed it so that he can really say, as he says in Matthew 11, "Come to me. You are weary and heavy laden. I am meek, and you will find rest for your souls." Well, for that, you have to have humility. And of course, Philippians 2, 1 through 11, Christ can empty himself. He is the ultimate example of keeping his ego out of it. He can release what he most glories in. And don't shrink back from that word glory. We're created for glory. It's just that we chase so much empty glory. And in that passage, Philippians 2, Paul says, do nothing out of empty glory or selfish ambition. Rather, look at the one who had all the glory of God. So he had legitimate glory, a glory you're created for. Those he foreknew, he predestined. Those he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. Those he justified, he glorifies. So you look at the one who's the source of that glory, Christ, and he emptied himself of it. That's humility. Self-mastery, meekness, and humility require you to master your Gethsemane moment so that you can release the thing you most glory in. I've had this conversation with several people in the past week. How many of you have seen the movie Gladiator? Okay, it's not for everybody. At the beginning of the movie, Maximus, the main character, and his right-hand man, Quintus, are leading these Roman legions into battle against these Germanic tribes that haven't surrendered. And they send a guy to ask for their surrender, and the guy comes back not in the best of shape, as in like dead, beheaded. And so Maximus and Quintus are talking, and they say, their answer is no. And then Quintus says to Maximus, people should know when they're conquered. And Maximus says to Quintus, would you? Would I? There's a self-awareness, because a lot of people who are leaders, because it's rooted in passion, something that may have kicked in their early 20s, they can't let go. Jesus can let go. He can master his Gethsemane moment and let go. He has that kind of humility and awareness. And a lot of leaders don't. They think leadership is, look, I fight over every hill. I impose my will. Never realizing, don't you understand that the fallen human will is actually like the biggest problem? And that humility, though it makes them very aware of themselves, it makes them gracious to others. It's a great short article by Ryan Holiday about how people who are really in a good place they're so good at letting things go with other people. And he's very blunt about it. He says, all right, next time your passion flares up because someone cuts in line, get over yourself. You're guilty too. And here's what he says. Like you've never cut in line on purpose or on accident? Like you've never done something selfish or spoken with an attitude? Like you've never been jealous or petty or mean? Of course you have. You've done all these things. We all have. Yet when other people do them, it's somehow different. We need to talk about Dave's eldership. It's a transgression. It's a violation. We need to deal with this. Well, we do. But we stew. We plot. We spew insults. Because when they do it, oh, that's intentional. It's a sign of bad character. It must be stopped. Come on, Holiday goes on to say. When we butt up against someone else's awfulness, we need to always remember when we ourselves have behaved just like that. We need to consider patiently the motivations of the person responsible and try to give them the benefit of the doubt. Remember what I said about gentleness? What's the least damning explanation for their behavior? That the evidence can support. You don't deny evidence. Okay? We need to consider the crazy possibility that they aren't irredeemable. Who knows? They may even think they're doing the right thing. Who's the ultimate biblical story of an irredeemable jerk who thought he was doing the right thing? Paul! He didn't turn out to be irredeemable, did he? Because God first, since he acted in ignorance and unbelief, and then later Barnabas said, okay. And Paul got redeemed. So whatever is just sticking in your craw today, let it go. Leaders are good at that. We're all plenty guilty of our own sins and stupidity, which is why we need to forgive and forget other people's sins and stupidities. We need to give them the same clemency, which is really a good old English word for that term, gentleness. That same clemency and patience we grant to ourselves. This is the essence of the golden rule. It's easy to treat others the way you would like to be treated when everything's looking up. It's when the chips are down that the golden rule is hardest to employ, which of course is when it is most important to employ. Humility, self-mastery. To do those things, and this is just a bullet point list and it's a bridge for next week. And I didn't intend this to be anything more than a bullet point list. These are just my own observations. And like I said, we'll launch here next week. You've got to manage key vulnerabilities. Okay, you lead people. You manage problems, starting with your own. Here's some key vulnerabilities in my now decades in leadership. If you want to manage key vulnerabilities, number one, you've got to master the AAA club. Acceptance, agreement, and attachment. And we'll talk about these more. But the fact that I accept something does not mean I agree with it. And we will all say that logically, but a lot of people cannot handle that emotionally. They think that if they accept something, it means they say it's okay. It doesn't. It just means you accept it. Because most things are not worth dividing over. A lot of people cannot do that. Why? Because of their own attachments. That's a big one. Number two, catastrophic thinking, fear of evil. Mark and I just talked about this. Yeah, when you're young, you're like, oh my God! Then you get old, you're like, that's probably not that big a deal. It shows up even how you parent with your first child versus with me, my fifth. And then Mark and I were also joking, some of that's just because you get tired too. But we're prone to catastrophic thinking. Something goes wrong and we start running through how all this is going to snowball into the end of civilization and God's church as we know it. You're like, no, it's not. But when something is really evil, and I mean like, you're like hair off on the back of my neck kind of evil. Most people who engage in catastrophic thinking can't deal with that. And the leader gets calmer when that happens. Managing problems, that's the head, versus leading people, that's the heart. A lot of people try to create the right system to deal with every possible thing that can go wrong. And we do that with our systematic theologies. Realize, okay, that's important. You want to have the best possible system you can. And then realize it's never going to be good enough. So you got to stay for people and managing and leading people, connecting with their hearts. Number 4, perspective, the arrogance of my own point of view. We all presume we're right. Number 5, initiative, ask, seek, knock. God says, ask, seek, knock. And he already knows what you need. I think that's a very powerful statement about a leader will trust people with things. The leaders should be a high initiator. And I will freely confess, I often get stuck in response mode. And then I miss things that I should be initiating. But the leader empowers other people to initiate, like God does, and says, if you don't even ask me, I'm not going to respond, and I already know what you want. Can I give you a hint? I don't know what you want. You must tell me. But even where God does know, he's like, until you ask and you seek and you knock, then we're just going to sit here. Because that's empowering you. Take initiative. Sorrow, grief, and repentance. Or how godly sorrow can change you and create a purifier, 2 Corinthians 10. There's really 3 phases in this. Someone who has no sorrow, someone who has a lot of sorrow, and it is sorrow, but it just makes them isolate themselves, withdraw, and Paul says in 2 Corinthians 7, leads to death. And there are biblical examples of this. Think of Judas. Think of Old Testament Saul. So there's no sorrow, which is obviously bad. Then there's like worldly sorrow, which is still sorrow. We don't need to dismiss it. But it doesn't take it to the next level, which changes you. And Paul says, it's godly sorrow and brings a fire, an indignation, a purifying fire to show that you've changed. And it leaves no regret. Managing grief and sorrow well is massive as far as being who God wants us to be. Methodology. This is from Peter Tague, this quote. Don't theologize your methodology. Can I add a point to that? Or your political party. That's just another methodology. Don't theologize it. Meekness and self-mastery manages your own perceptions and your expectations well. It isn't about being right or imposing your ideology. It's about loving people and speaking truth. And there is a little bit of a difference between being right and speaking truth. Okay? There's a lot of reasons why we could say we love the truth. A lot of them have to do more or less with, because I like being right. But we're not right. That's at the heart of the gospel. We're wrong. We're all varying degrees of wrong. So there's another reason to love the truth, and that's because it heals. The truth sets you free. So don't theologize your methodology, your system, your way of doing things. It will just basically make you impossible to live with, except for everybody who has the same method and system that you have. And when we divide based on our method, our system, our tribe, our culture, our way of doing things, we kill the church. Not that we can succeed, but we can succeed in killing this church. We're not going to kill the church. So don't theologize your methodology. We have to manage key vulnerabilities. And there's one on that list that I wanted to land on, and I didn't even put it up there because it's so big, I just wanted to camp on it at the very end. You, me, all of us need to have a very, very strong, healthy handle on our sexuality. Just read your Bible and how many people wrecked themselves in that area. We're all vulnerable. We're vulnerable to acceptance. We want everybody to agree with us. We all have attachments. We all can get spiked up into catastrophic thinking. We all fear hideous evil. We shouldn't, but we do. We all have a lot of problems. We all have deceptive hearts. We all have the arrogance of our own points of view. We all struggle to take appropriate initiative the right way. We all have sorrows. We all have griefs. We all need to change. We all tend to have our preferred way of doing things and then try to argue why it is the revealed way, when very few things are. Not no things, but few things. We all want to be right. And all these things, not managed well, show a lack of humility, a lack of gentleness, a lack of self-mastery. That's not leadership. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this time. I pray that you would help us to be meek and gentle and to truly keep imitating Christ, our greatest leader. I pray these things in his name. Amen.